Hey guys, as you know, the middle game is a very complicated phase of the game. However, there are some tips or tricks that we can follow to make fewer mistakes and play more accurate moves. The best thing is that if you apply these ideas, you can always know where you are going and you won't be confused anymore in your middle games. So, without further delay, let's get into my 3 tips to play better in the middle game. So the first idea I want to suggest is going to be especially useful for those middle games where you're not sure about how to play. Like, you finished the opening, you made it to the middle game, you're really happy with your position, but then you look at the board and you say, well, now what? What should I do next? Because you don't see a clear plan or a clear move for that turn. So whenever that happens, this rule can be very helpful. The idea is that you're going to find your worst piece and try to improve it. And this is not going to work only in very specific cases when there is a tactic or a sequence you're missing. Out of that, in most of the cases, this is going to work really well. Imagine you're finding the piece that is not doing anything or not doing too much, and you're putting it in a better square, doing some work, helping the rest of your pieces working together. It has to work. In most of the cases, it is going to work and it's going to improve your position. I found this game where Ninsowish is playing as white, and I want to highlight 2 moments in this game. One is very simple and very basic. The other is much more complicated and probably more interesting. So this is the first moment. Here Ninsowish is playing as white, and the move he played is just doing this idea of finding the worst piece and improving it. As you can see, this is a normal middle game position. All white pieces are doing something more or less fine. They are in good squares, more or less active, but there's one piece doing nothing, and that piece is the rook on a1. So the move that Ninsowish played was just improving this rook. In the game, he played rook from a1 to e1. Actually, also rook a1 to c1 was very good. This is an open file, and the rook is also going to be very well on the c file. The idea of rook e1 is that this file is not open right now, but it's very likely to be open very soon, as there might be a trade over here, and that's why he brought his rook to e1. So this is a very basic example. This time it's a rook, but also sometimes, for example, we have a knight on c3 is doing nothing because there is a pawn on c6 dominating that knight, and we can bring it to the king side. It's another common situation where we are finding our worst piece and improving it, putting it where there is actually action on the board. 18 moves later, they got this position on the board. As you can see, they have been trading a lot of pieces, but we still have queens on the board and a couple of minor pieces. Black king is not safe. It's very open, and also the queen and the knight are very active, creating some threats over there in some specific squares. Well, in this position, Ninsowish found a really nice move. He found his worst piece, and he thought, if I can improve this piece, I could be winning. I mean, only with the queen and the knight, I'm creating many problems. If I can bring another piece in some good active square, this is going to be a big problem for black. So this bishop here on d2 is doing nothing right now. Some pawns and pieces are blocking the main lines, so the bishop cannot get involved by now because of those pieces. However, he found a way to make it play. In this position, Ninsowish played the surprising move b5, and the idea is that now the bishop has an access line over b4 to f8 or maybe to d6. There are many interesting ideas with that bishop. Observe that the king is very open on a dark square. There is a whole dark diagonal totally discovered targeting the king, so the bishop is going to be great if we can actually bring it to d6 or f8. In the game, black played queen g7, and of course after queen takes g7, king takes g7 and b takes c6, white got a piece up and he won the endgame more or less easily. But I really want to show you what can happen after this b5 if black takes the pawn on b5. So after a takes b5, Ninsowish could have played knight e6. That's the whole point of this move, b5. After knight e6, he's threatening queen f6 check. That's a very serious threat. Black doesn't have too many ways to stop that threat. Probably the only move is h5, and then we have this continuation, queen f6 check. The only move is king h7, we can play knight g5 check, and the only move is king h6. At this point, we can involve our bishop using the line we cleared previously, so our worst piece is probably going to be our best piece in the rest of the line. We can play here bishop b4, going to f8, and this is just winning the game. Maybe black can try something like h4 here, but then we have this check, as we were saying, bishop f8, king h5, and then knight e6, just clearing g5, so we are threatening queen g5 checkmate. Maybe this could be a last move in the sequence, g5, now the queen protects. We cannot mate right now because the king could be escaping. There are some ways to win, but probably h3 is the best. You make sure the king does not escape, and then you're threatening queen h6, knight g7. If the queen moves, you're also going to h8, so this is just going to be winning with this a3. So for your own mid games, if you're not sure how to continue, find your worst piece and try to improve it. This is going to work very well, very often. The second tip I want to give you to play better in the mid game is going to be accumulate small advantages. It's going to be very hard to win games because our opponent blunders a queen. That is not going to happen very often. So it is going to be a good idea to start accumulating the small advantages, and this is going to make it much simpler. So assuming our opponent doesn't make any blunder or any big mistake, we can still win on our own if we do this idea of collecting some advantages during the mid game and then try to convert later. There is a great example by Petrosian. He's playing as white in this mid game. They are just starting that phase of the game. They're just getting out of the opening. Here, white is going to play a very instructive move, and I'm going to say it. It is this b4. The idea with b4 is that white is going to start a very typical mid-game plan. By the way, if you want to learn how to make a plan in the mid-game, you can take a look at this video. I think I can include it up there or also in the description below. In that video, you can find a lot of interesting stuff about mid-game plans, how to create the plan, which are typical mid-game plans, what are masters playing in the mid-game, and I really recommend that video. It's going to be really interesting. So the idea is that Petrosian played here b4, and at this point he wants to start a minority attack. A minority attack is an attack that we create when we have fewer pawns on the side of the board, but the whole point of the attack is that we want to weaken the enemy pawn structure. So what he wants to do with the b pawn is to break over here and disconnect enemy pawns. If he can do that, he's going to create weaknesses, and then he can target those weaknesses later in the mid game and probably even in the end game. So what he wants to do is to collect advantages. He wants to create weaknesses and use them as targets in the rest of the game. Well, b4, black played a6 here. He traded the bishop for the knight at this point, and then he played a4. Black played bishop f5, and then there's a trade of bishops on f5, and finally the move we were talking about, b5. Whatever happens now on the queen side, black will have some trouble in the pawn structure. If they capture, isolated pawn here, and probably some weakness over here as well. If they don't capture, white will capture, and then there will be a backward pawn on c, and also a very nice outpost on c5 for the knight. And I think that's what happened in this game. So a takes b5, a takes b5, queen d6, and then b takes e6. As I was saying, if the queen captures, weak pawn on b7 and weak pawn on d5. So this time black just took with the b pawn, and in the end we got what we wanted when we started our minority attack plan. In the game, knight a4, trying to get this outpost. By the way, we are talking here about collecting small advantages. Observe here we have a weak pawn, and also we have an outpost on c5 for our knight. But don't forget, he's just doing that, collecting advantages and exploiting them. Black played here rook f b8, and then knight c5, queen e7, and then knight d3. There are some maneuvers over here. Queen b7, the knight from f goes to e5, another interesting square in this position. There's a trade of bishops on e5, there's a trade of rooks on a1, and at this point knight e7, g3 to open and give some fresh air to our king. We don't want to receive checkmate. Queen b2, queen d1, h5, rook c1, don't forget the target is c6, rook b6, h3, king g7, king g2, and then queen a3. At this point, rook a1, queen b2, and g4. And we are getting closer to the moment we want to highlight. After h takes g4, h takes g4, rook b7, white played rook c1 again, queen b5, and then queen f3. Now there is a threat over here. Black played f6, and this is the moment I wanted to highlight. Try to find the move Petrosian played at this point. I'm going to say it very soon. So, in this position, Petrosian found the surprising move. Observe black pieces are a little tight here, defending the pawn on c6, also covering the 7th rank, and the king has been a little unprotected. Also, the pawns have been advancing, so the king is not totally safe. Also, there is an open file on h, and this is going to be key in the next sequence. So, he found here the surprising g5. And this is very strong because he's not defending the knight. So, I mean, the knight is hanging, and instead of defending the knight, he says, okay, you want to take the knight? Well, now you can also take a pawn. So instead of defending the knight, he gave even more material. But this is winning, I think, in all the lines. I mean, the whole point is that now he's attacking the pawn on f6. Now the queen is getting in, but also he's going to use the h file, and the pawn on g5, if black doesn't take it, it's going to be another piece in the attack. So this is just winning, and don't forget, black pieces are not helping in the defense. In the game, black played here knight f5, but I want to show you after pawn takes knight, we can play queen f6, and after king g8, rook h1, and this is just winning the game for white. Well, knight f5, g takes f6, king takes f6, rook takes e6, and well, of course, this is already winning for white. After king e7, queen f4, the king is totally discovered. White has already some material up, so black resigned. And this is another example about accumulating small advantages during the middle game and exploiting them later. This one was played by Nimzowicz as black. Also, I wanted to talk a little about when I say small advantages, what do I mean with that? And we need to say that we are talking about some of the things we have already seen in the first example, like a weak pawn. It could be an isolated pawn or a backward pawn. Also, we could be talking about an outpost, or about controlling an open file, or maybe keeping the two bishops in an open position, or in a position where it's not open yet, but we know we can break and finally get to open it later. Well, in this game, the position is more or less equal, but we can see that this bishop is not such a good piece. And also we can see that this pawn on c4 is very weak. It's not going to be protected by other pawns. That means that if black attacks that pawn, white needs to defend it with pieces. So Nimzowicz played here queen b7. He wants to bring the queen to the queen side, where it's going to create some damage and create some threats. White played king g1 and then queen a6. And then we are putting pressure here on c4, pressure on the bishop on a3. White played queen b3. Knight c6 is very clear because we could be playing knight a5 very soon. Rook fd1 and then knight a5. White can still defend this. They can play queen b5. Observe that knight a5 is attacking both b3 and c4. But queen b5 is going to survive, more or less, not too long, but at least they are not losing material. After queen b5, black can trade, and then they can play knight c4. We are talking here about collecting small advantages. Don't forget that this bishop on a3 has been a bad piece. It's also going to be blocked for a long time because this pawn on c3 is not going anywhere. We are going to make sure we are fixing that pawn for a long time. So the bishop is never going to be great. That's already a very small advantage. But also we need to talk about the knight on the outpost on c4. That's already great. Observe white doesn't have a light squares bishop to get rid of our knight. So our knight could be there for a long time. Besides, we are gonna get another advantage in the next moves. White plays here bishop c1, and black is going to play something really special at this point. It's something very subtle, something very simple, but well, you know, he's just making it simple. He's just getting a huge advantage playing normal and simple moves. Black played in this position a6, and this move is just very strong because it's going to create a weakness on a2. So he's going to double rooks on a, and he's going to put a lot of pressure. Observe, white cannot play a4 because then we capture and there is a pin, so they cannot recapture. So white is more or less forced to capture on a6. Rook takes a6, d takes a5, trying to open the position a little, but this does not change too much. We can play b takes c5. Knight g2 is trying to bring the knight over, I guess, over the center to get rid of the knight on c4, but Ninsowish found a very accurate move, and that move is knight d5. We haven't talked too much about this pawn on c3. It's also an isolated pawn in this position, talking about collecting the small advantages. Well, white played here rook d3, black played rook f a8, too much pressure here. After e4 we have some ways to win, but the move Ninsowish played is good enough. He just plays here knight e5, and this is just winning the game because the rook was defending the pawn on c3. Now we are attacking that rook, so the rook needs to go back, and then we are taking the pawn. We have some checks in some lines over here. Also the pawn on a2 is going to fall. So as you can see, Ninsowish created some weaknesses and got some small advantages, including one more time a knight in a very nice outpost, and finally he just took advantage of them. He just exploited those small advantages he collected, and in the end he won this game because of that. And finally, the third tip I want to give you for your middle game positions is going to be thoroughly evaluate every single trade. It's a very common mistake, especially among beginners or intermediate players, to trade everything they are offered. So the idea is that we don't need to do that. I mean, when we are trading pieces, we are putting very often a couple of pieces off the board. So when there is an option of trading, we should think, is this going to be good? The fact that those two pieces go away and disappear is going to help my position? Is that going to improve my position? If the answer is not, then you should not trade. So there are many examples of positions where we should not trade pieces. This is a very basic one, but it's one of my favorite chess games. This is the game between Karpov and Spassky in 1974. If you want to see the whole game, I will include it up, I think, or also in the description below, because now I just want to highlight this specific moment. They are just getting out of the opening, and Karpov played here the move knight b3, knight in the center. He just moves it back, he retreats, and he goes to b3. How do we understand this? Well, he's just avoiding the trade of the knight on d4 for the knight on c6. And the whole point is that black pieces are a little passive. They are colliding with each other. So he just wants to keep that situation there. White has more space, and there's a principle for the middle game stating do not trade pieces if you have more space. You're just helping your opponent. So there are situations like this where we are not supposed to trade pieces if we want to improve our position. And this is a nice example, but also there are other moments and other situations I want you to observe. It's not only about avoiding trades when it's not good for us, it's also about creating and offering good, interesting trades. So that's what this tip is about. And I want to show you another example. This time we are playing as black here. This is a game by Petrosian again. And well, this is another game. I think this is an artwork. What is going to happen here? The move Petrosian played at this point is something really special. I really like it. I find it really instructive. I will say it very soon. If you want, you can try to find it. At this point, Tigran Petrosian played the move knight d7. Let's try to understand what is going on here. This is a normal middle game. We have two minor pieces on the board. The two rooks are still here. And suddenly, Petrosian wants to trade the bishop of his fianchetto on the king side. How do we understand this? How does this make sense? When do we want to trade the bishop covering the dark squares, the weak dark squares on our king side? Well, there is a very interesting, instructive, and subtle explanation for this move knight d7, but I find it really nice. The idea here is that there's an outpost here on c5. That's the whole point. And the only defender of that square is going to be the bishop. So as long as the bishop is here, white can get rid of our knight on c5 whenever they want. And as long as the bishop is not on the board, we can bring the knight to c5 and the knight is going to be there as long as we want, and it's going to be much better than the bishop on e2. So we will have the advantage during the rest of the middle game and also during the end game. So it's going to be really good for black if they can do that. About the attack possibilities on the king side, this time we don't need to worry that much about that. There are some reasons for this, and one reason is that there are not too many pieces on the board. I mean, 3 minor pieces have been traded, so the attack should not be so strong, keeping that in mind. But also there are other things. For example, white pieces are very passive. They are not ready to attack too much. And also there is an open file, so it's not going to be easy to distract all the power, for example, to the h file and those things, when we know there is an open file in the center and black can also put a lot of pressure over there. So the idea is that the attack on the king side should not work very well. However, the pressure using the outpost and also using the open file should be very dangerous. So if he can get rid of this bishop, he's going to have the advantage. And if you find the move knight d7 instructive and surprising, maybe you will find even more surprising the move white played here. And it is going to be bishop e3. Avoiding the trade, they don't want to remove the bishop of the fianchetto because they know that the bishop needs to cover c5. The rest of the game is going to be just amazing. It's going to be very short, but you know, one of these Petrosian's games where there are positional sacrifices. At this point, Petrosian played a move that, well, I think we need to talk about it. It is going to be a positional exchange sacrifice, and it's going to be the same thing we have been talking about. The bishop is the defender of the outpost on c5, so he just played here rook takes e3. After pawn takes rook, well, now he brought his knight to c5. How do we understand this positional sacrifice? How do we know that something like this is going to be good in our own games? There are some things we need to highlight about this position right now, and they could help you evaluate situations like this and decide how good it can be when you're playing your own games. For example, here we are talking about the knight on c5, the knight in the outpost, but also we need to talk about the bishop on g7. This bishop is unstoppable over the great diagonal, so that's also something we need to keep in mind here. Besides, this bishop on e2 is a bad piece. It's blocked. It's being blocked by white pawns on light squares. And finally, we need to talk about the weakness we created. There is a weak pawn here on e3. All these things are going to make the position good enough for black. And the positional exchange sacrifice, very interesting and very powerful. In the game, white played queen c2 and Petrosian played rook e8, bringing the rook to a better square, putting pressure on the weakness. Rook f3, bishop a6, we need to target that pawn on e3, queen c3, queen e7, more pressure over here, and at this point there is a blunder, but the position was already very hard for white. Here white played rook b6 and then knight a4 is just going to, you know, fork, but also taking on e3 later and getting a huge advantage. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. If you want to learn the 15 most important middle game principles, check out this interesting video over here. I'm sure you will enjoy it and it will help you a lot. Thank you so much guys, like, subscribe, see you on the next.